This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 475 of the Late Round Podcast, with many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the questions this week, I want to let you guys know that the FanDuel Podcast Network Listener League, it's back this week. Enter the rake-free weekly NFL contest made exclusively for you, the listener, for just $5 and compete for your share of the $1,500 prize pool, including a $150 first place prize. To enter, visit fanduel.com/league/listener league. Eligibility restrictions apply. The first question this week is an email. It says, "Hey JJ, huge fan of your work. Thanks for all the analysis and entertainment." Thanks. For those of us who play in leagues with waiver wire priorities instead of free agent auction budget money, how does starting off the year with a high waiver priority impact the way you think about roster construction? For example, if you have the number one waiver priority after your draft, would you feel more compelled to trade a handful of usable starters for a single stud, knowing that you could pick up a backup running back off waivers when a starter inevitably gets banged up in the first few weeks? Think Mike Davis, Giovanni Bernard, Boston Scott from last year. Thanks, Skyler. Well, first, keep in mind that it's not automatic that we're going to see some league-winning player off the waiver wire. Or I should say, it's not automatic that you're then going to choose that league-winning player. For every Mike Davis, there are 10 not Mike Davises. Waiver wire players in most leagues are not very good. Even the players that you mentioned in this question, like Giovanni Bernard and Boston Scott, they weren't that good. Bernard didn't give you a usable week until week 6, and you weren't even starting him then. And he had plenty of duds in between some big games. Boston Scott was actually even worse. He had a top 12 performance once in 2020. I think a lot of times in fantasy football, we look at things in hindsight, and we think that we'd easily be able to capture hindsight takeaways when we're actually making decisions. What I mean by that is we see Mike Davis and we say, oh wow, I could have just had Mike Davis instead of going hard after an RB2. I would have been fine with Mike Davis. And that's true, you could have been fine. But you also could have gone hard after other players and not gotten Mike Davis. I mean, even the week that Mike Davis was a big waiver wire ad, it's not like people were sitting there saying, blow your budget on Davis. You've got to absolutely get Mike Davis. So I think what's happening here is you may be overreacting our ability to predict who's going to be usable off the waiver wire in a given week, even when an injury occurs. I did a study on running back handcuffs a few years ago that actually showed that when a handcuff finally had their opportunity, they still didn't really produce. They were typically just RB3s. Now, some of them are going to hit, yes, but the majority of them are not. And banking on that, that's tough. Now, from the standpoint of in-season roster management and who you sort of hold on your roster in a given week, having that top priority could mean that, let's say, you get a defense for the following week before heading into a slate of games versus getting a running back handcuff. Like if you have a roster spot available and you want to fill it, you could look for a defense in the next week to stream as opposed to a random handcuff. That way you know that you can still get that handcuff if the low percentage injury occurs because you have the top priority. That's fine. And trading bench assets to improve your starting roster, that's more than fine. I just wouldn't be drastically changing my roster construction because of that waiver claim spot. Because once you use it, it's gone. And the chance of really hitting on a player after using that claim, it's not as high as you probably think. The next question is also an email. It says, "Hey JJ, first off, love the show. You helped me take second for the 4th time in 9 years and for the 2nd year in a row." And then it says, "Hey, it's money at least." Yeah. My question is going to bother me all offseason. We are a 2-player keeper league, and the only caveat is your 2 keepers can't play the same position. My first keeper is Travis Kelce, not much to think about there. Where I think I have a serious debate is which running back do I keep, Saquon Barkley or Nick Chubb? I think I'm overthinking this because of Barkley's injuries the last 2 years. Would love and appreciate your insight and knowledge. Thank you, Casey. So first off, I've gotten a lot of keeper questions, and I gotta say, if you don't have to make a decision right now, at least let the offseason play out a little bit. And remember to listen back to episode 391 where I talk about keeper league strategy. But since this is a pretty straightforward question that's basically asking, would you rather have Saquon Barkley next year or Nick Chubb next year? My answer is Saquon Barkley. Nick Chubb might honestly be the best runner in football. but he doesn't have nearly the pass catching ceiling that Saquon has. Chubb hasn't seen a double-digit percentage target share in his career yet. And that's even if you look at his prorated numbers. Saquon gets that high of a target share in his sleep when he's healthy. As I alluded to earlier this week, Chubb did outperform touchdown expectation this year. So we've got some regression working against him as well. It's not that I mind Chubb. I don't mind Chubb at all. I think he's really good. I just would assume that Barkley's going to have a higher ADP, and for good reason. The receiving component to his game makes him an elite asset when he's healthy. This next question says, can DFS strategies help out in season-long leagues with tons of parity? Could stacking, double stacking, etc. lead to even higher point ceilings? What about streaming correlated players/defenses? Yeah, they can lead to higher point ceilings. It's not like you're scoring points in a different way in season long than you are in DFS. The same concepts apply. So if you have a quarterback and you have his wide receiver and that wide receiver scores a touchdown, you're getting points for the quarterback too. The difference is that it's obviously a lot easier to do in DFS, and it's clearly more applicable too. In DFS, you've got the whole player pool to choose from each and every week, and you can base your decision off of that week's game. In season long, you have to ensure that you've got the right stack just naturally through the draft or through a trade. And then in DFS, you're usually running highly correlated lineups and tournaments to capture the high side of the variance. In season long, you may not have to go that deep because it's typically a head-to-head environment. Now, with that being said, Establish the Run's Mike Leone did a really great article on this last offseason. One of the findings is that it can be advantageous to stack during your draft because when a quarterback hits, his pieces hit as well. And by pieces, I mean pass catchers. If your goal is a high ceiling, then of course the same strategies can be utilized in season long. You're scoring points in the exact same way, even if your player pool and the structure of the game is a little bit different. This next question says, hi JJ, love the show. Thanks. Do you expect Zeke to return to form next season? From a quarterback, offensive line, and health perspective, his situation should be the same or better across the board than it was through week 5, at which time he was the RB3 overall. It seems like people are ignoring a lot of key factors, his hamstring injury affecting his performance, the loss of Zach Martin, when evaluating the poor finish to his season. Thanks, Jason in Wisconsin. I couldn't agree with this more. I shouldn't say I'm surprised by how people are viewing him in redraft and dynasty, but like you said, he was totally fine when things were optimal in that offense this year. He was averaging over 22 PPR points per game when Dak Prescott was healthy. And that was on a little over 70% of the team's running back carries and a 13.5% target share. And look, I like Tony Pollard. I think he's a good running back. But Zeke wasn't even that bad this year in comparison to Tony Pollard. Elliott actually finished with a better success rate than Pollard did. And his yards per carry versus his teammates' yards per carry, it was in line with what happened in both 2019 and 2017. So yes, all of this combined, I'm almost definitely going to get Ezekiel Elliott in drafts in August. This next question is from @dmendy02. As it stands right now, how are you feeling about Miles Sanders and Joe Mixon next year? So I tweeted this when Doug Peterson was fired, but I don't really think his firing affects Miles Sanders either way. This past year, Sanders had the 8th highest running back rush share per game in the NFL. And he had a high target share too. And of course, that's when he was active. I think there's this idea that Miles Sanders wasn't getting a full workhorse workload this season, when that was really more driven by the Eagles being bad than anything else. They couldn't just force feed him the ball because they were trailing. His peripherals were more than fine. Now, will the Eagles be better with a different coaching staff? That's the hope, right? That's why they fired Doug Peterson. And I definitely believe in Sanders as a talent. So I would feel fine about Miles Sanders moving forward. I just don't think the logic for liking Sanders now should be tied to Doug Peterson. And then regarding Joe Mixon, I'm sort of surprised by how easily people are forgetting what happened with Joe Mixon this season. The Bengals did start using him more as a receiver. He only played in 6 games, but his prorated target share was 12.3% this year. In 16 games last year, his target share was 7.6%. With the hopes of a better offensive line and hopefully a healthy Joe Burrow, Mixon could be a strong value next season. This next question is from @Jazaris. Why has auction drafting not become more popular, especially in the pro/industry realm? Auction waivers are consistently cited as part of weekly waiver columns, but it seems that auction drafting has remained relatively flat. What gives? Well, keep in mind, whatever the largest number of people do, That's what content is going to be focused around. If everyone's playing snake draft leagues, we're going to write and talk about snake draft leagues. So to your question about why auction isn't the focus in the industry, it's because content is going to be geared toward the most common league, and that's a snake draft. But I personally actually do just as many auction drafts every year as I do snake drafts. It's just not smart for me to only do content around auction drafts since it won't be worthwhile to a large portion of my audience. I also think there are two reasons they haven't caught on the way that some want them to. And look, I'm a huge auction draft fan. I think they're better than snake drafts. But number one, they take a lot of time to do. And it's more of an investment, not just in time, but in knowing the values of each player. You're not just forced to pick. But the second reason is that it doesn't mimic the NFL as much. I think a lot of people enjoy snake drafts because it has the NFL draft feel to it. You don't get that in an auction. The last question this week is from @Brett D. White. How large of a role do you envision Myles Gaskin having next season? Look, Gaskin can go in a lot of different directions. One of the issues for him is that Miami has a lot of early round draft picks. And those early round picks would be what really derails him from seeing a lot of volume. And in turn, it would derail him from being a high-end fantasy asset. We know that all players in fantasy football need volume to be good. And even though if I were the Dolphins, I wouldn't be spending at running back, the fact is, Gaskin wasn't highly sought after when he came out a couple of years ago. And it wouldn't be that hard to see a coaching staff not be all in on him as a workhorse because of his size. And then in addition to all of that, the Dolphins will probably need a running back anyway. They found some success with guys last year, but the running back room doesn't have a ton of solid, reliable depth. That means they'd even be more likely to draft a running back this year regardless of round. Again, this isn't my opinion of what I would do if I were running the Dolphins. It's just my opinion based on how I've seen teams run in the past and the type of running backs they currently have on their team. Gaskin, to me, if we look at the rest of his career, he's likely more of a part-time player that might get a boost with an injury. That's just my guess. Of course, anything can change, especially at the running back position. Because at the running back position, all it takes is a coaching staff who believes in a player for him to get a lot of work. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoy your weekend, and I will talk to you next week.